if you have your Constitution, I'll start by saying this. There's George Washington. He did not want to be there. You probably know that after he helped to win the war, he resigned his commission and wanted to return to Mount Vernon to spend the rest of his life. And he was modeling himself on Cincinnatus of the ancient world, that you only come to do public service when they really need you, and then you retire just as quickly as possible. And he knew that he thought that his reputation would depend upon his going home. Because if he stayed in power, then he'd be just another one of those people who helped win a war and then refused to return to private life. The first attempt at the Constitutional Convention in Annapolis the previous year failed. It didn't even get a quorum. And so Madison and Hamilton, who then were friends, went to Washington and said, "This will not work unless you come." And Washington said, "No, I can't do it. It will destroy my reputation." They finally wore him down, and he came, and his presence there gave it the stature and the credibility to succeed. It might not have succeeded without him, but it's a paradox, because although he almost never spoke during the 100 days they were doing this, when they came to define the executive, they didn't really dare talk about what can go wrong, because it was clear that he would be the first president, and so they were all a little squeamish about this. If he hadn't been there, they probably would have put more controls in on the executive, and so there's a paradox here. So there are many such paradoxes, and I don't have a particular point of view. I do think we need a new constitutional convention. You'll decide for yourself after this conversation, but I must say one more prefatory thing. I'm very uncomfortable criticizing the current president, but I'm going to have to. Not because he's a Republican or MAGA or anything else, but the Founding Fathers were very certain they did not want a powerful executive. They built in constraints. They had kings. They didn't want any more of that. And so they built a relatively moderate or weak executive in the president. Jefferson said, that may be true now, but the president's going to grow stronger and stronger and stronger. And beginning with the 2 world wars and Theodore Roosevelt's enormous charisma, we've moved to a stronger and stronger and stronger executive. And during the George W. Bush's administration, you remember that a theory developed of the unitary executive, which means the president can sort of do whatever the president wants to do. And now we have the situation in which the current president, whether you're a Republican or Democrat or MAGA or neither, the current president is forcing us to have this conversation because he has said that he wants to shatter norms, that he's not going to abide by the norms that other presidents have abided by. And so he requires us to have a conversation about this, and I apologize for that. President Obama did some things that would be impeachable if Thomas Jefferson were in charge. So it's not partisan, really, and we've had this growth in the executive branch until it is so powerful that it would really offend and appall the Founding Fathers. And whether we can restore balance is an interesting question. And of course, this is then and that was then. So that, the Constitution was written by men in wigs and tights and buckled shoes in a 3-mile-per-hour world. Now we have a world that travels at 186,000 miles per second. And so probably we did need to make adjustments. All right, so let me start. So here we have Monopoly on the left and chess on the right. And you know that when you play Monopoly, there's a set of rules, right? And you have to play by those rules or you can't play Monopoly. Maybe chess is an even better analogy, that if I'm playing chess with you and you're playing by the rules and I decide that my knight can jump 6 different pieces at will, end of game. In other words, everything that has a structure, a game, has a set of rules, and if you don't play by those rules, then it shatters the whole paradigm. So here's one I made up with my ChatGPT today. So what if an NFL NFL quarterback said, yeah, I'm just going to do a fifth down and maybe a sixth. Well, that's why we have referees, right? And so the Constitution is the same. It says what Congress can do, what the judicial branch can do, what the executive branch can do, and it sets guardrails around their powers. And as you know this, that working from Montesquieu, the great French political philosopher, the idea is checks and balances and separation of powers. So Congress can pass a law, it takes both houses, but then the president can veto that law. That's a check on the Congress. If the Congress really wants to do it, they can override the veto, and then the judicial branch can weigh in. You know all this. This is Civics 101. The system was designed to prevent any one entity, not Congress, not the courts, not the executive, to have too much power. And when that breaks down, the rules are shattered, and we are now in such a situation. And again, I'm not saying that this is solely the current president. President Obama's executive orders on DACA and the Dreamers, for example, are an appalling accumulation of power that should be done in the legislative branch. Something of that importance should be legislative, not executive. Executive orders aren't even in the Constitution. So think of that. The Constitution doesn't give the president the power of executive order, and yet they use them hundreds and hundreds of times. They're meant to be on little things like, when does the cabinet meet? Or under what circumstances do we do this in a diplomatic situation? They weren't meant for these gigantic initiatives, because that belongs to Congress. And so we're in a situation now, and it's not just this president or this party, where the rules are being systematically broken. And when the rules are systematically broken, then you don't have any way to check power. And we have one serious check on power under our Constitution, that's impeachment. There have been 4 of them. Andrew Johnson after the Civil War, President Clinton, and 2 for Donald Trump, and in no case has there been a conviction. And so that mechanism has not proved to be effective. Leaving those 4 out, surely you will agree that in the course of American history, there has been a president who needed to be removed from office. And so that mechanism was designed for that, and it has failed. So we need either to rewrite the Constitution, or we need to revise it to give it more teeth, so that we can protect ourselves and our liberties from government. All right, so here's this quiz I want to take. So raise your hand as we do in these things, if you wish. How many of you think the Constitution is just fine as it is? We should leave it alone. For those who are streaming, not a single person raised their hand. This is pretty interesting. How many of you think maybe a few adjustments and clarifications and that's enough? So that's about, I think 15%. No. You could vote many times, though. We need major revisions to the Constitution. I love this because I suppose that's one reason why you're here tonight, but I certainly agree. Oh, now see, I've done it. We need to tear it up and start all over. Just a handful. All right. A constitutional convention in this era would be insane. I'm hoping to convince you otherwise. We need to lower the amendment bar so that amendments are realistic. And so here's the paradox of this, my friends. This is the paradox of our time. The last amendment was in 1992. That's a long time ago. There have only been 27, 10 right off the top, the Bill of Rights, so they don't really count. That leaves 17. Some of them are sort of frivolous, prohibition, repeal of prohibition, things like that, or what day the new presidential term starts. Only about 10 of them have been really substantive. The one in 1992 was about, guess what? Legislative salaries. If you're old enough, you remember that crisis when they were using the Congressional Post Office to loan themselves money and so on? It was nuts. But that does not, in my opinion, rise to the level of constitutional amendment. And none since. Why? Because it takes 2/3 of both houses, try that today, and then it takes 3/4 of the states. And so we've effectively made it impossible. So what we need to do is to lower that bar a little. Let's say it would be 60% of both houses in 2/3 of the states. Something like that. Nothing radical, but bring it down a little. How do you do that? You amend the Constitution to make that happen, but you can't amend the Constitution because you can't get, it's a paradox. So we're stuck, we're paralyzed. The majority of you said we need changes. Those changes cannot come from the Congress of the United States. They can only come by going into the document and adjusting it. But you can't go into the document because the trigger was set so high, and there's no way around this. So this is one of the stucknesses. And the Founding Fathers thought they were doing the right thing because under the previous Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, it took unanimous consent to change it. And so they thought, well, we'll lower it considerably, but not enough. And the genius of an amendment system is you don't want to make it too easy, otherwise you'd have 350,000 amendments, but you don't want to make it impossible either. And so now we're in this difficult position. Here's where my friend Jefferson comes in, but let's finish the quiz. We should probably have a new constitutional convention. What if the next one is worse? How many think that? Well, I'm glad not too many. So I see most people are at 2 and 3. Let's go do some things, but let's not get too wild about this. All right. This is long, but this is my man Jefferson. This is such a great thing. He wrote this in 1816 when Virginia was considering a new constitutional convention. And by the way, almost every state has had more than one constitution. Only 5 states are on their original. Some states have had 4 or more. Most states have had at least 2 or 3. And the average length of a constitution in the states of the United States is about 20 years. This is what Jefferson wrote in 1816. He was not at the Constitutional Convention, by the way. Some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. I knew that age well, I belonged to it, and labored with it. It deserved well of its country. It was very like the present, but without the experience of the present, and 40 years of experience in government is worth a century of book reading. Then moving on, I am certainly not an advocate for frequent and untried changes in laws and constitutions. No, I think moderate imperfections had better be borne with. But I know also that laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths disclosed, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. And now this. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat that fitted him as a child, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. I just love that. Think of what we take for granted. Cell phones, air travel, cruise missiles. I mean, the Founding Fathers could not have, if Madison were here today, he would faint at the idea of electricity. Imagine what Lewis and Clark would have done if they'd had a cell phone. Okay, Mr. Jefferson, what do we do now? We need some resupply, Mr. Jefferson. If your watch or your cell phone can tell you the latitude and longitude of any place on Earth instantly, Lewis spent hundreds and hundreds of hours trying to ascertain latitude and longitude. Medicine in Jefferson's time was bleeding and purging. Jefferson said, whenever I see 2 doctors in a road, I look up to see whether there are turkey vultures flying overhead. We are governing ourselves with an instrument made in a 3-mile-per-hour world, and they were geniuses and they did great things, but they could not have anticipated everything. And because we continue to try to do this, to stretch the coat that fitted us as a child, it puts more and more strain on our system. And when things go wrong, we don't have a mechanism to right it because it's just so metaphysical now. The other thing that does, if you're stuck with a Constitution written without any of the things we take for granted. That puts enormous pressure on the court system to decide what is a cruel and unusual punishment, what is free speech, what is an establishment of religion. And so it seems to me that Jefferson was more right than we are, and we do look on the Constitution as a sacred document, and that's going to really prevent us in some important ways from doing great things. Just want to do one little quick, lovely, I hope lovely digression here. How many of you have seen the Constitution and the Bill of Rights at the National Archives? They weren't always there. Through the 19th century, they were just in a vault at the State Department. And then beginning in the 20th century, people in Washington said, you know, the people should be able to see those. So then they were taken to the Library of Congress and put in a sealed case. It wasn't until 1934, when the National Archives was established, that they thought maybe these documents belong in some splendid hall where all Americans can come and see them. And that's what happens when you go in there. There's a real feeling of reverence, I think. But those documents weren't moved there until 1952. On December 13th, 1952. What was going on in 1952? The Cold War. And so when they were moved on that day, it's amazing. They had tanks and armed guards in every direction. There was like, we have to protect this sacred document, because what if Russia destroys it? Then what? Well, I'm all for protecting sacred documents, but we do have a zillion copies of it. It's not as if we'd be out of luck. You know, yes, I like the parchment, but it's not the only document we have. So here you see it. It's being brought in. Harry S. Truman was there. It's being brought off a tank under heavy armed guard. And look at this. Whoa. I didn't know this until I started working on this, but that shows reverence, doesn't it? You know, that's where you expect the Quran or, you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls to be protected. And I think between that time and now, the American people have lost a lot of their reverence for almost everything. I doubt that today we would amass the military to move it to a new site. And there it is. Look how fabulous that is. It's a shrine. You know what Jefferson would say? Don't do it. Don't make a shrine out of it. It's just a recipe for government. All right, so Philadelphia, 1787. 55 white males, not Jefferson, not Adams, not Patrick Henry. 55 white males, mostly prominent. 74 had been chosen, 55 came. Most of them were lawyers, had helped write state constitutions, had served in the war. These were men of great privilege. No black people, no women, no Native Americans, no free black, no enslaved black. It was what you would expect for that era. A bunch of very privileged white men of enormous property and largely wanting to protect property. The oldest was Franklin at 81. The youngest was Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey. 39 eventually signed it. 3 refused. The governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph, Elbridge Gerry, from whom we get gerrymandering, and George Mason. The most frequent speaker was a person you probably have not really heard of, Gouverneur Morris. That's his first name. I wish he'd been elected governor of Pennsylvania, governor, but he wasn't. Gouverneur Morris. He had a peg leg. He had lost his leg somehow, and he was a very cosmopolitan fellow. And he liked people to think that it had happened when an angry husband was chasing him out of a carriage. That's probably not true, but he loved that story. He spoke 173 times. Washington spoke once. Franklin 4 or 5 times. 4 never spoke, nor spoke only once. The most frequent attenders were Rufus King, about whom we don't care. Madison, the father of the Constitution. Roger Sherman, who was a big advocate for freedom of religion. And James Wilson, who was one of the great constitutional theorists of that era. Here are a few of them. That's Washington, of course, Hamilton, Adams, and Franklin. Jefferson and Adams were not there. But again, you see that the Constitution was written by men in wigs Here's a famous painting of it, of course. Franklin there in the front. Hamilton whispering in his ear, that probably didn't happen. Franklin was not particularly fond of Colonel Hamilton. You probably know that Hamilton came and went, and he gave a speech on the 18th of June, 1787, a 5-hour speech in which he outlined his ideal American system. Do you want to hear it? You should have known this before you went to see the musical. President to serve for life. How many of you would like that? Senators to serve for life. Governors to be appointed by the national government. The national government to have veto power over every act of every state legislature. He said, the people, they're a beast, they're a rabble, they're entirely incapable of governing themselves. And yes, he meant you. He said, they must be managed. He said, let us reduce the states to mere administrative units. That's Hamilton, so go ahead and sing along. Here's Independence Hall. What's amazing is that they had a secrecy rule and it held. They sealed the windows. They actually sealed the windows. It was a terribly hot summer. They were all sweating. No one bathed in that era. They took snuff. Why? To overcome the locker room smell. They were for 100 days there. And here's the chamber. I'm sure it never looked that good. Madison, the father of the Constitution. All right, and this is what Madison said, and this is one of the wisest things ever said by an American. This is in the Federalist Papers, which were a propaganda campaign to support ratification. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. It doesn't get any wiser than that. So just to back up for a minute. So what happens when the colonies declared independence, and the date we use is July 4, 1776, but it happened at different times in different of the 13 colonies. That, in political theory, returns you to something called a state of nature. There is no government. Then each state was asked to devise a constitution, and they all did. Then the Articles of Confederation were written in 1776, but they weren't ratified till 1781. So we didn't actually have a constitution during the war, but they agreed to abide by some of its provisions. When it proved that the Articles of Confederation were highly imperfect, there was an Annapolis Convention in 1786, there wasn't a quorum, and then finally, in May through September 1787, we got the Constitution that we have. It's important, and I know I'm going over things that many of you already know, but remember what Dr. Johnson said, mankind requires more often to be reminded than informed. I live by that principle. So we have our formal Constitution, you all know it, you have a copy of it. It's about 4,500 words. Then we have norms. The cabinet is not in the Constitution. State of the Union addresses are not in the Constitution. Executive orders are not in the Constitution, and on and on and on. Those things have just burbled up, many of them by Washington, but they aren't in the Constitution, and therefore they are not enforceable. And you've seen with the election of 2020, when the results came in, President Trump refused to concede the election. Nothing requires him to do that. Nothing requires the outgoing president to stay for the inauguration of his successor. John Adams didn't stay to see Jefferson succeed him. He left town at 4 a.m. on the stage. He was bitter, and he had some family issues too. And so these norms are exceedingly important. We live by them, but they're not codified, and so you can break them at will. And recently, they're being broken with some energy. Steve Bannon, who's a really interesting guy, believes we just should break the system so we can start over, and then you have to shatter norms in order to do that. And the last thing here is the way we constitute ourselves. What do I mean by that? you drove over here. We go to restaurants. We join health clubs. We ski. Most of what we do has nothing to do with government. There's government behind it somewhere, but most of what we do is how we constitute ourselves as a people is outside of government. These things all have to swirl together in a society like ours. So here are a few interesting facts about the Constitution. The word democracy never appears, and the Founding Fathers didn't like the idea of democracy. They called it mobocracy. They didn't really trust the people, so they wanted a republic on the lines of the ancient Roman Republic. The Constitution nowhere guarantees the right to vote. Slavery is never mentioned in the Constitution, though it is perpetuated and protected, especially by the 3/5 clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause. Think of this, it's never mentioned. And when they met in Philadelphia, South Carolina led the way for several southern states, and they said, like on day 2, if you mess with slavery, we're out. We will not abide any attempt to control or eliminate slavery. Imagine that as a way to start the convention. And we needed unanimity, and so a series of difficult compromises were forged, especially the 3/5 clause. To put it in our sort of slang terms, they kicked the can down the road, and we kept kicking it down the road until it led to the Civil War and almost 700,000 deaths, the greatest military death per capita in American history. And even that, as you know, didn't solve the problem. And the civil rights, some of you lived through the civil rights era. It was a breathtaking time in American life. It didn't entirely solve the problem. So race has been central to the American paradox from the beginning. Political parties are not contemplated. Think of this, the Founding Fathers were geniuses, but they didn't think there would be political parties. Were they nuts? I mean, almost immediately. What happens, Jefferson later acknowledged this, that when you group people together and you start deciding things, you tend to fissure into 2 groups, those who are for, those who are against, and then it becomes artificial. And Founding Fathers didn't appreciate that, and so they built a system that has some really serious flaws. And there are no references to cabinets and so on. All right, so here are these 10 quick insights. One is they were only supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation. The state legislatures told them, that's all you get to do. They immediately decided to revise the whole thing, and when you do that, the door swings open and you can't control it. That's a warning to us. If you think there could be a targeted constitutional convention in our time, history doesn't seem to bear that out. There are the Articles, by the way. Weaknesses of the Articles, it was just a league of states. Congress had to requisition tax funds, and the states could decide to send them in or not. There was no national executive, there was no federal court system, there was no authority over interstate commerce or foreign trade, there was no power to enforce laws. Each state had 1 vote only, and important legislation required 9 of 13 states. So it's an impossible situation. But see how they were so determined not to create a strong government of the kind that they had just broken with in England. And so they overcompensated to make it so weak that it wouldn't work. And so finally, an amendment's only by unanimous consent and a unicam system. So that's why they met in Philadelphia. It was an extra-legal adventure because they had not been, the laws of each state said you can only adjust that thing about revenue. Here's where Jill Lepore comes in. How many of you have read Jill Lepore's new book on the history of the Constitution? It's a long book, way too long. It needed an editor, but I can summarize it quickly for you. But her main argument is it wasn't meant to be permanent. The people who wrote it knew that it was a great first draft and that over time we would rethink things, revise it. Things we couldn't have counted on would come to our attention, new technologies, new social demographics, and so on. They expected it to last about 25 years. And they expected it to be amended frequently. That has not been the case. Says Jill Lepore, like any machine devised by humankind, it could weaken and stagger, wear down and break. The Constitution is a machine. Amendment is the mechanism that the framers devised to repair it. Now I repeat, they thought they were lowering the bar from unanimous to the 2/3 formula. They didn't lower it quite enough, but they thought they were doing something bold. Number 4, the problem of representation. We've been through that. 55 delegates, all white men. Imagine trying to do that today. And then just about women. I love this letter, and most of you know this letter, but this was a letter written by Abigail to John in 1776, one of the great early feminist utterances in American history. They had a wonderful relationship. It was playful. They teased each other. She was a pretty strong feminist, and her husband was not. She said, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men," that's like all men would be tyrants. They're using it in the generic sense. She's using it in the gender sense. "Remember, all males would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." It's fabulous. That your sex, your gender, are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Oh, yeah. So she sends that to poor John Adams, and how should we say this? He completely muffed it. He completely muffed it. He wrote back and said, "Oh, geez, I thought we had already troubles with England and everything else. And now," he said, "now we're going to have a rebellion from the distaff side, from the females." He said, "Rather than do this, George Washington and others and I will fight." I wonder how she reacted to that letter. Number 5, ratification. They wisely, in Philadelphia, decided that they couldn't just impose this on the American people. It needed to be ratified state by state. But here's the thing, and you can read about the ratification process. It's fascinating. There are great books on it. But essentially, they forced through ratification before an opposition could build. In other words, if there had been an actual plebiscite in 1788, and they said to the 4 million American people, "Do you want to ratify this Constitution?" it would almost certainly have failed. But the founding fathers wanted it so much to prevail that they didn't rig the ratifying conventions, but they put a lot of pressure and made it very fast so that before there could be serious opposition, it would be ratified. Number 6, big state versus little state. That was the great issue at the Constitutional Convention. The little states like Rhode Island, Delaware, Massachusetts, were afraid they'd be swallowed up by Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York. And so they insisted that every state have an equal representation in the government. Madison thought that was nuts. He wanted every state to have proportional representation, so that Virginia would have much more power than little Delaware. And the Great Compromise occurred at the end of June, and you know that compromise. The House is proportional. California has almost 50 representatives. My North Dakota has 1. And only because you have to get at least 1. Thank goodness. But the Great Compromise said that every state got 2 senators irrespective of population. This is the Great Compromise. I don't know what you think about it, but I think it's silly. I'll come back to that. Number 7, it's only 4,543 words long. And then Jill Lepore says of that, what has made the Constitution durable is the same thing that makes it demanding, the fact that so much was left out. So we had to fill it out later with habits and norms and congressional legislation. So it's vague on some really important questions. Here are the most contested clauses in the Constitution. The General Welfare Clause. You have no idea how that has been abused. If Congress wants to do something that's completely wacky, and you know what that means, they say, well, it's for the general welfare. And Jefferson said, if that's your criterion, anything goes. Second, cruel and unusual punishment. Lopping off of ears was not considered cruel and unusual punishment at the time. Maiming was hanging, in some cases drawing and quartering. So what they thought was cruel and unusual is certainly not what we do. The other elastic clause is the necessary and proper clause. So after enumerating all the powers of Congress, the founders said, and they should be able to do whatever is necessary and proper to make those things come to life. And Hamilton said, I'm going to use that. And then, of course, the establishment of religion. We continue to be bedeviled by that to this day. And I don't want to go into this, but the Second Amendment. Imagine if we had a constitutional convention today and we had to wrestle with that amendment. I think it would make January 6th look like a picnic. I come from North Dakota. I literally know people in North Dakota who said the Second Amendment is the most important thing in the Constitution of the United States. Interesting. Here's Jill Lepore, looking happy after bestseller. Here's her argument in a nutshell. The Founding Fathers did not think they were writing a perpetual constitution, and yet we have that. Number two, they wrote Article 5, the amendment article, so that the people would amend it and fix the problems and keep it current. Number three, the American people have been reluctant to amend and unwilling to tear up and start over. Number four, the great breakthroughs in our national political system have come during a few periods of serious amendment, right after the Civil War, during the Progressive Era, and during the 60s. And finally, we need to reinvigorate the amendment system. I agree, but you can't do it because you have to amend the Constitution to reinvigorate the amendment system, and it's just not likely to happen. Number eight, they built this thing and then they began to wrangle about it instantaneously. Interpreting what the Constitution permits and doesn't permit, what it means and doesn't mean, has been the whole business of American political life. And the first great quarrel was over the National Bank of the United States, when Jefferson on the left and Hamilton on the right came to blows about whether the government of the United States could create a national bank, essentially the precursor of our Federal Reserve System. Hamilton said, yes, it's necessary and proper. It's for the general welfare. And he was probably right. But Jefferson said, where in the Constitution does it authorize a national bank? It doesn't. And yet Article 1 says you can coin money, you can levy taxes, you can send diplomats, you can fight wars. It has a long list of things that government can do, a long list, meant to be exhaustive. And Jefferson said, I don't see a national bank in that list. Hamilton said, well, the general welfare, the necessary and proper. And so they wrote these famous memos that George Washington had to read. And Jefferson, I think, is philosophically right, but Hamilton was pragmatically right. Hamilton said, if you do strict construction of the Constitution, you'll be hamstringing, you'll be straitjacketing, you'll never be a great nation, you'll be stuck as a primitive agrarian republic. Hamilton won. After a long and really divisive political debate, George Washington reluctantly sided with Hamilton, and we got the Bank of the United States. This is 1790-something, 4, I think. And there it is, beautiful, beautiful building in New York City. Look at that. Whew. And there's a watercolor of it. All right, so I've just talked about strict construction and implied powers, but Hamilton was for implied powers, Jefferson was for strict construction. And just to anticipate a snarky question, when Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory in 1803, he used implied powers. He was really paranoid about that. When Napoleon offered us 828,000 square miles for 3 cents per acre, doubling the United States for $15.6 million, Jefferson actually thought of saying no because he was a strict constructionist. And Madison said, I'm paraphrasing, are you nuts? You're doubling the size of the country for 3 cents per acre, and you're going to get stuck on a constitutional nicety? But Jefferson was such a purist that he actually wrote 2 draft constitutional amendments, one to authorize the purchase, and the other to incorporate the territory by way of new states. And he wanted to send those out and ask you, the sovereign, if you wanted to do this. And Madison said, A, Napoleon is showing signs of remorse. Don't give him an opportunity. And B, are you nuts? And finally, Jefferson accepted Madison's wisdom, but he didn't like that, because he said, and I think we understand this, once you open the door to broad construction, all bets are off, which is, of course, exactly what happened. We've talked about the amendment paradox. This is another one of my brilliant ChatGPT images. How do you get over that bar? 38 states. Try it. What do you think 38 states could agree upon now? What do you think 2/3 of both houses of Congress could agree upon? We can't even pay our TSA agents. I mean, think of that. 10, it is back to Jefferson's vision, it's impossible to reform a broken constitution from within the system. Here's who would fight against a constitutional convention, whose oxes would be gored: the existing Congress, executive branch, and the judiciary. Imagine saying to Congress, we'd like you to authorize a constitutional convention in which you're going to lose a lot of power. The oligarchs and the kleptocrats, corporate lobbyists. Imagine a new constitutional convention with lobbyists. And then Second Amendment absolutists. Here's this. The Second Amendment, we could debate this for hours, I don't want to, but the Second Amendment was really meant to authorize a militia system rather than a permanent military. The Founding Fathers hated the idea of a standing army and a permanent military establishment, and they thought, well, we'll have a militia system, and if you're going to have a militia system, then the farmer citizens need to have weapons in order to do that. But that's not how it's been interpreted by the people or increasingly by the courts. And this is, I apologize for this, but you see, I think a cheap shot on the Sharpie, frankly, but there you are. But I'm not just beating up on Mr. Trump. This is during FDR's, when he was doing his alphabet soup New Deal, same thing. People said, he's trampling on the Constitution. We do that when it's convenient. All right, it's broken, I think. We need to address the war powers. I don't want to go into much about this, but let me say this. The Founding Fathers wanted to avoid let's say three things above all. A gigantic national debt that could never be repaid. Check. A runaway executive. Check. And not just this one. And war. They were so committed not to move into the European model of endless wars that they built special controls into the Constitution to make sure that couldn't happen. All wars must begin in Congress. Now, the president can respond if the Canadians cross the border. We can fight them back. But then you have to go to Congress to get authorization. So all wars have to be authorized by the Congress of the United States. Period, end of story. Since our incursion into Korea in the 1950s, that has not been the case. So it's not just this president, they all have been doing it. But remember, if you remember the war against Iraq in 2003, George W. Bush got authorization from Congress. Just ask Hillary Clinton. She voted to authorize, and that was one way that Barack Obama was able to displace her in the primaries. He went to the UN. We didn't get authorization, but there was a lively debate. He went to our friends in the EU and NATO. In other words, George W. Bush, wanting to fight a war in Iraq, went through the process, and he got the authorization that he deserved, that he wanted. I won't say deserved, that he wanted. That's what they wanted you to do. That's what they wanted every president to do. That no president could do this without going through Congress. Why? Because war is the gravest thing that any nation will ever do, and the people are the ones who fight it, not the politicians, and the people are the ones who pay for it. And so they were really, really adamant about this, and they would be freaked out by what we've been doing since 1950. And especially now, because, and again, without wanting to be unnecessarily hard on the current president, he didn't even consult Congress, much less get authorization. And that's what they were trying to prevent. Because when you go to war, you want the will of the people to be behind you. And the third guardrail they put in was the power of the purse, that Congress has to vote the money. We don't do that anymore because we just print money. You know, what if, I mean, I'll take it out of the current situation because I don't enjoy any of this partisanship at all. This is constitutional stuff. But imagine if George W. Bush, when he wanted to go to war, or Lyndon Johnson, for that matter, had gotten on national television and said, okay, we have to go to war. Congress has approved. It's going to be very expensive, so I want each family to get out your checkbook and write a check for $28,500. You think we would have gone to war in Iraq? Never. That's what the Founding Fathers wanted, is that the people would have to sacrifice. The people would have to endorse. The same is true of a draft. I mean, imagine if we had a universal draft, how many wars do you think we'd fight? We depend upon these wonderful patriots who come largely from working class backgrounds, frequently in the South, who joined the all-volunteer army. We're blessed to have them. But if you had a draft, there would be as you remember, if you were alive in the 60s, there would be a very, very lively debate about war. Those are the controls the founders wanted. Both parties have abandoned them. I think we have to go back to this. How many of you would like to have more constitutional control on war? And yet, Congress 3 times in the last 3 weeks has refused to vote a war powers resolution. And if they had, let's just say they were on board, and I think they would have been. They could have said, yes, we'll authorize this, that's what we're supposed to do, but you need to report on a regular basis, we need statistics, we need projections of cost. That's what the resolution could have said. That's not like saying you can't fight a war, but you have to let the American people know. They didn't do that, and so I don't blame President Trump for this as much as I blame Congress for abdicating its special duty to check any executive, even if you agree with that executive. This is why I say the system is broken. Emoluments, and I won't tell you the story, but the emoluments clause came because Benjamin Franklin accepted a little creepy little plaque from another country, not a $470 million airplane. And they all do this, but none more than the current guy. Impeachment, we've talked about pardons. Think of President Clinton's pardon of Mr. Rich, a total corruptionist, somebody who deserved to be in prison, not pardoned. The power of the purse is largely gone because we just print money or borrow it. Right. There are some fundamental weaknesses we need to address. Richard Lubunsky says, something has gone wrong. The Constitution is in need of serious repair, even with its features that provide for self-correction. The Constitution can only be stretched so far. The problems are so extensive that neither judicial amending of the Constitution through decisions, and that's where the courts come in, nor incremental changes brought about by constitutional amendment will be enough to solve them. In other words, you have got to step back and start over. I won't go through that. Here are things I think we would have to look at: the Electoral College, the makeup of the Senate, the impeachment clause, the Equal Rights Amendment, the right to vote, war powers, balancing the budget, gun violence and gerrymandering, the size of the House, campaign finance reform, term limits, including Supreme Court term limits. One vote, statehood, or some other way of letting the people of Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia have more oomph than they have. I mean, come on. The revolution was fought over no taxation without representation, and so you have 500,000 people in the District of Columbia who are effectively disenfranchised. I know why they don't want to do it, because we both know what kind of a state that would become. That would be blue to the max. All right, so I'm going to close here and take your questions, because I'm so much more interested in hearing from you than just gabbing on here. But this is the one. Every state gets 2 senators. There we go. Okay, there we are. My state, North Dakota, has 780,000 people. We get 2 senators. Wyoming has 586. Alaska, 733. Vermont, 647. Add the total population of those 10 states up, comes to 9.7 million. And they get 20 U.S. senators. California, with a population of 40 million, gets 2 U.S. senators. How many of you think that's okay? 4. I have a plan. It's not original, but I would give, and I'm sure I'll get booed on this, I'd give California, Texas, and Florida 5. Illinois and a few other states 4. Ohio and a few 3. Minnesota and Kansas 2. And loser states like my own would get the minimal 1. You could still have 100. And it might not be what you want. I mean, most of us think, oh God, in California with 5 US senators, but it would be more democratic in every possible way. Now, whether we want to do that, I don't know, but I think we can't do it because of this. The small states were so adamant about this that they forced the constitution makers to put this clause: no state, without its consent, shall be deprived of its equal suffrage. So in other words, you can't change this formula because you'd have to get North Dakota and Vermont and Alaska to consent. Guess what? They're never going to consent. So they embedded it that deep so that we couldn't mess with it. But I think it's not fair. And if you do the math on this, a handful of states can hold up the whole business of the country. And most of those states are red states, be that as it may, but it's not majoritarian, and the Founding Fathers wanted a system of majoritarian rule, and we haven't quite done that. And how many delegates, if we had a new constitutional convention, I had a great meeting with Kyle, who's an AI expert here today, and I said, what if we had a constitutional convention, how many delegates would we have to make it representative? Obviously, we're not going to have 55 white men and women, people of all races, Native Americans, Jews and Gentiles and Methodists and Zoroastrians. You know, if you actually said, what is the demographic makeup of the United States, and you want it to be a truly representative, if everyone is a stakeholder, how many delegates would you have to have? And he said, well, more than 55, probably something like 440. And he showed me algorithms that could do this and find an actual sample of the American people who could meet for a month and devise a new constitution. I said, well, first of all, I didn't understand almost anything he said. It was algorithm after algorithm. But he said, believe me, there are such models. They can be made to work. We could have a representative sample. Be interesting to try, don't you think? Be really interesting. Let's just do it as a civic engagement. We don't have to actually make it stick. I'd love to see the results. They'd probably put most of the same provisions back in, but they would adjust the emoluments clause and the pardons clause and so on and so forth. All right, I'm just going to stop here if I can figure this out. A couple of books to read if you're interested in this. Sanford Levinson, who's coming here in June, along with Bo Breslin, my friend from Skidmore College in New York. We're going to talk about what a constitutional convention would be and the pitfalls and the problems, and both of them say it ain't going to happen. And then Levinson has also written this book, Written in Stone, about public monuments, and that is very, very interesting too. So we have an all-star cast coming for you in June. It's going to be just fabulous. And then Judy Woodruff too. It's an embarrassment of riches. And then Doris Kearns Goodwin in August. And the reason she's coming, I think I can fairly say this, is I've been in 2 of her documentary films now, both on the History Channel, one on the Roosevelts, on Theodore Roosevelt, and the other one on 10 episodes in the history of the American West. And I love this sort of thing, where you get interviewed and you don't know if you're in it or not. And so she said, I owe you one. And I said, okay, come to North Dakota. She said, propose something else. Which hurt, which hurt, I will tell you, it hurt. But then I said, well, how about Vail? And even then it was almost impossible because she's incredibly busy and she can command $1 gazillion. And there are lots of protocols. For example, and I don't mean to betray any privacy, but she, on the day of her talk here, she wants us to have a hairdresser available. And I said to James, where's my hairdresser? I get nothing, man. She gets whatever she wants. Oh, she gets. But she's coming. Isn't that fabulous? She's coming. And I played a role, but James has done the hard work. And it is not easy to get someone of that stature who's in that demand on the year of our 250th birthday to come to Vail. And I know you are proud of this place, and I am too. But she regards Vail the way you regard North Dakota. It's just like another place somewhere in the West. She's not going to be skiing at her age. And so we are so very fortunate. She's going to talk about her memoir about her husband, Richard Goodwin. And it's one of the most, if you read it, it's one of the most beautiful books of our time. He was a major figure in in JFK's New Frontier and in LBJ's Great Society. In fact, he wrote the War on Poverty speech. If you haven't read it, read it in advance because it's going to be a spectacular event. So let's take some questions, shall we?
Welcome.
Yes, thanks.
What does Article 1, Section 4, the election clause, come into effect with the present president?
Say that again.
The election clause, which says Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations having to do with the election of representatives, the midterm elections.
So the Founding Fathers were Federalists, by which they meant the states were not going to be just swallowed up. There was going to be a balance of national authority and state and local authority. That's the 10th Amendment. I'm sure you all know it. Those powers not delegated to the national government belong instead to the states and to the people. They were very serious that the states would remain strong and central to American life. Madison didn't like that idea. He wanted to nationalize the government altogether. But the federal balance of state and national prevailed. So elections, as we all know, are profoundly state and local things, and the states get to decide exactly how they want to do elections. So you can have paper ballots here and no paper ballots in Montana and so on and so forth. I have felt for a number of years that we need a national election protocol law so that we can regularize it so there isn't that crazy confusion that occurs when the election is passed and people then create conspiracy theories because something happened in Wyoming that they don't understand in Florida. So I think we need to create some general protections and protocols so that we can make sure that elections have validity, because when their validity is questioned, you know what happens. And people doubt whether they're living in a free society or a self-governing one. Now the current Congress is thinking about passing the SAFE law, and they want to require IDs, positive IDs. That probably and it's actually in polls, that's very popular with the American people. I think we need to have a nonpartisan commission to devise this new set of laws so that neither party can try to manipulate it. But I do think we probably need it because it's so varied in many states, and you know what happens. For example, in 2020, I'll take President Trump's side on this one. Pennsylvania and other states allowed votes to come in after the deadline because of COVID and so on. And so it was just so crazy that there were so many things that people could point to and say, is this legitimate? How can this be regarded as okay? I think we need to find some standardization and yet still let states have their own control of these things. In Jefferson's time, the states did not all vote on the same day. Each state, in his election in 1800, some states voted in April, others not till September. And the Electoral College, by the way, as long as we're on this subject, the Electoral College was devised for that reason, that transportation was crazy. Georgia was so far from Philadelphia that you couldn't really gather the votes on any given day. And so they then would have them come over time on stages and horses and ships and so on. And then an Electoral College would count the votes and determine the presidency. We don't need that anymore unless we want it, because we now can all vote on the same day, and the election results, except California, are usually known later that day. So the national government does have the right to do this, but they want to be very careful because the tradition in America is that states are the central authority of this, just as in the laboratory of democracy. So Oregon and Colorado have done very successfully with mail-in ballots. Other states not so much, and I think that's okay. It doesn't seem to me that we have to have that uniform a system. So it's a balance. But I think that the irregularities of the 2000 election, Bush v. Gore, and the irregularities of the 2020 election are such that we need national clarification. But I don't trust, do you? I don't trust either party to propose that legislation. Period. James. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. You showed about 20 different things you'd like to see in a constitutional convention, and I'm sure in this group here, we could add another 50 to that list.
Sure.
And it becomes, it's already an impossible thing, but you get more and more things, it becomes ever more impossible. Why not do this in an iterative way and pick one topic and have a convention on, see if we can just get one thing done and just try to get one done and see where that leaves us, and then, perhaps pick the next most important one a year later. Because I think the approach of trying to do your list, which was, I guessed it was 20, was it 18? Go back to your list.
No, we don't. There were a lot.
So, but my point would be, isn't there a way to do this more iteratively than let's just think of every single problem in the world and solve them all in one big pass?
Yes, I think you make a good point, but I'll just go back, if I can find it, to one of my first propositions, and that is when you open the door, you can't target. Every constitution that's been redone in the last 100 years has either attempted to target and failed or has just watched the doors swing open. So it is possible that we could do that. And here's how I would start. I'm with you. I think we should amend the Constitution rather than tear it up. But since we can't amend it, if I had to choose one, it would be the amendment clause. But since we can't amend it, we can't do it. And so this is, the best chance we have, I'm with you in spirit, truly I am. I think the best chance we have is that 3/4 of the states can also demand a constitutional convention, and they could each in their legislation say, for the purpose of amending the amendment clause only. That doesn't guarantee that you can control it, but it makes it more likely. Yes, I don't think we're going to start over. I would like to start over because I think we're broken. I think it shows. We have a dysfunctional Congress. We have runaway presidents. We have a Supreme Court that's become a political branch of government. The average citizen has effectively been disenfranchised by Citizens United and a series of other court decisions and events in our history. We're meant to be self-governing. You're the people. Let's say there are 100 people in this room. If this were the republic, you're the sovereign. You get to decide how you want to be governed. No one gets to tell you. You hammer it out. You agree upon a set of codes, and then you abide by those codes. We're so far from that now that the average citizen is effectively ignored, not just, say, in going to war without congressional authorization, but in many other things that we do. And so I think this is very dangerous. And I don't know about you, but I feel I'm a very privileged person. I get to fly on a jet to Vail and stay in a fabulous hotel and talk to some of the most interesting people I will ever meet. But I feel that my sovereignty and my rights as a citizen are being eroded, and not just by the current administration. How many of you agree with me that we're losing our sovereignty? And we have a right. Rousseau said, the people are always right, even when they're wrong. In other words, we have a right to devise any system we want. We could make a communist system, a socialist system, an oligarchy, an aristocracy, a monarchy, a dictatorship. Whatever we decide, we get. But no one of the founding fathers thought, well, it'll just become what it becomes and the rest of us will just live with it. So, yeah. Yes, please, Megan.
All right, several online questions. Why can't we get by with just the First, 14th, and 9th Amendments, along with a law that requires the courts to prioritize the use of substantive due process?
Why can't we get by with the 1st, the 4th, and the 9th?
First, 14th, and 9th.
Oh, 1st, 14th, and 9th. Well, first is, of course, the huge amendment about free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. We definitely need that. And we've been pretty darn successful with that one. As you know, the 14th is under fire because some people want to eliminate birthright citizenship. And so we should really address that. Most countries do not allow birthright citizenship. We happen to do it, and it's been one of the strengths of the American system. But it also can be abused, as you know. That's a debate we need to have, but it's an amendment, and you can't change it by law. You can only change it by amendment. I don't think you get to pick and choose. I think we need them all. We need the Fourth Amendment. which protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures. We need the fifth that protects you from having to incriminate yourself or having your land taken without due process and without compensation. We need the amendments that prohibit cruel and unusual punishments. I think we need them all. The only one that I would jettison is the third, which says you can't quarter troops in people's houses. And I think we're sort of beyond that, although we'll see, right? I'm serious. It's not just this administration. We are sliding into a less free society, and the people are asleep mostly. I don't know how many of you are going out tomorrow, but some of you, I bet, will. And there will be millions around the country. And I think that's exactly right. A peaceful demonstration saying, we're not so sure we're liking what's going on. That's America. That is America. Whether it has an effect is another question. But I think that's a really healthy thing from any point of view, whatever your politics are. That people demonstrate, dissidents, the right to be unhappy is a really important American right. And in Iran, that right doesn't exist, as you know. They killed more than 20,000 people earlier this year for doing what will be done in Rifle tomorrow. Think of that. I love Rifle. I always think when we do these programs, when people say, well, what's it like in Vail? And I say, well, they're well educated, they're well informed, they're well read, they're centrists mostly. And I think we should take the same program to Rifle and try that. And I'm not saying that Rifle is a bad place. I'm from the Rifles of the world. I like the populace. I like those shabby, windswept Great Plains towns. But that's a different demographic from yours. And people look at things in quite different ways. And everybody should belong. Everyone should have a legitimacy and agency and dignity in this society. And to the extent that if you're a leftist and you sneer at them, shame on you. And if you're a rightist and you sneer at the libs, shame on you. We have to be all of these things, and we have to learn to live together. And if we don't learn to live together, we are really toast. And so we have to start listening harder to the people we don't like, because they're not, well, some of them are morons, but no party has a monopoly on moronism. I can tell you that. Question.
Clay, this is kind of a personal question. Since you're from North Dakota, I used to know the two senators from North Dakota, both Democrats. So what happened to North Dakota over a period of time, within 6-8 years? What caused that?
I mean, why did we drift right?
Yeah,
Well, I think
just
there's...
from that state.
So when I was growing up, we had Democrat senators, two of the really distinguished ones, and we often had a Democratic governor. Now it's red. What happened? That's a huge question. There is a worldwide populist reaction against the status quo. And I think that's legitimate. The status quo, when people go to Congress, and they say, on day one, I'm going to start to balance the budget. And then they run for re-election, and a few terms later, they're just part of the same system. I think a lot of Americans are offended by the way that they're not listened to. And I think a lot of people in the heartland, particularly, are really angry, filled with rage that the elites on the East Coast look down on them, as they do, I can promise you. And they can't stand that, and now they're getting their revenge. A lot of what's going on now is the people of the heartland saying, we're empowered and we're going to make you squirm. And it's working. So I think that there's a worldwide populist reaction. I'm not quite sure I fully understand it, but it's not just here. I think that people are disillusioned. I think that I'm working a lot on this because of Thoreau, so we're kind of moving in a slightly different direction here. But Thoreau said, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. I don't think that's true, but I think the mass of people lead lives in America of disquietude, of like, something's not quite right in this civilization any longer. The vulgarization, the pop culture, the ad hominem political attacks, the whataboutism, the failure of Congress even to pay its bills. I think a lot of people are like, what? Why are we should be this extraordinary Jeffersonian model nation, and look at us, we're not. And I think that in my state, I won't say to you, but I will say, you people in Vail have houses that no North Dakotan could even imagine. When I went back to North Dakota in 2005, there was not $1 million house. Then the oil boom came. But we North Dakotans have been historically very modest people, and we've been populists, agrarian populists, and now we're MAGA populists. And I don't like any monoculture ever anywhere. I don't think I would want to live in Boulder, although I love Boulder. I lived in Boulder. I love Boulder, and that was before legalization. I don't think I would want to live in Boulder, because when I lived there, it felt a little kind of self-satisfied. And I remember they had an emergency town meeting when we lived there about how dare us be so privileged. Come on, let's get real. I don't like either monoculture on either side, and North Dakota unfortunately has swung that way. I think it will swing back. There are big moves in American history, and I think we're in one of the most interesting ones ever right now. But I think that the pendulum is swinging already a little bit back. The super wokeness that was so upsetting to the right has calmed down some, and I think that's important. People think that I might be a liberal. I'm not really. I'm a centrist. I have a friend in North Dakota who's a rancher. She's great, because she's a moderate Republican, and whenever something's going on in the country, I just say to her, Sarah, what do you think? And her view is, oh, come on. Can we have common sense? Is there any place for common sense in American life? And so she's sort of my barometer. And I think that, frankly, we don't need to talk politics here, but if the Democrats want to come back into power, I think they need to understand that the country is substantially less liberal than they think it is. And I know that's no fun for them, but the country is substantially less liberal than they think it is. And so they're marginalizing themselves. There's a question here. Oh, here. Okay, good.
What would the possibility for several states to form a political federation within the context of the larger United States be? And would this have some advantages?
Yes, it would. So the question is, could we have some sort of subsets? Jefferson was in favor of this. He said we should have sister republics. They shouldn't all pivot on Washington, D.C. We should have a bunch of sister republics, and they should have their own regionalisms. They have different habits of the heart, different ways of doing things. And he said as long as they're republics, small r republics, and as long as they speak the English language and commit themselves to a Bill of Rights, there should be room for a lot of diversity. And we have that to a certain extent. You probably follow this. For a while, there was a plan for something called Ecotopia. Remember that? And there was going to be British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. That was going to be Ecotopia. They would secede and form their own environmental green government. People in Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington want to join Idaho because they don't feel represented by the blue people in the state legislature. I think, there was a book by David French, which I reviewed, and I, in fact, interviewed him on my podcast, and he says that we could break up, but probably we shouldn't, but probably we should allow a great deal more regional diversity, that if Texas wants to be Texas, fair enough. And if Massachusetts and Vermont want to be what they are, fair enough. We should stop thinking that there has to be a uniform standard, except on things like the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment. And to a certain extent, that's true. You in Colorado pioneered the legalization of marijuana. I'm from North Dakota. We will be number 50, which has greatly increased your tourism, because when I was growing up, we North Dakotans came down to buy Coors. Remember that? Because they didn't homogenize it and it couldn't cross state lines, and we would come and it would be like a drug deal in Mexico, and we would fill the backs of our trunks with like 32 cases of Coors, and then go back and then sell them and have parties, and it was like, ooh, you are really a radical. You're getting some Coors. I love that era. And now it's like crossover into, even Montana has legalized marijuana, which is a little shocking. I think we're heading towards actual national legalization here, and I think probably President Trump will do that if he's not consumed by other things. And there are other things in the air, aren't there? It must be tough to be the president of the United States, any president. We're going to do one or two more questions. I'm having so much fun. I hope you are. This is what I live for. It's just like, when people ask me these questions, they think that I have answers. And so I pretend that I do.
Well, I hope you have an answer to this one, because the general headline of my question is propaganda and disinformation.
Yes.
And how do we have a civil conversation with our neighbors, people who think differently than we do, if we're not all dealing with the same set of facts, if we're being fed on a diet of falsehoods daily, the fire hose coming at us so fast that we can't even bother to fact check anymore? There's no way to have a convention of people who do not understand that we're swimming in a cesspool of propaganda.
Okay, but don't hand the microphone back. I have a question for you. Who do you blame? Who do you blame for this?
I blame you referenced Steve Bannon, and
Yes.
his great tagline is "Turn up the hate."
Okay, but you don't. But he's not alone.
He's not alone, but it's that ilk. Karl Rove. I blame Karl Rove.
Do you blame anyone on the left?
I'm sure, but I can't think of anybody who goes out of their. I can't think of anybody who goes out of their way to lie and turn up the hate on the left. There are people who go too far with certain fringe ideas, and they're not the central tenet of liberal thought. But the right will grab onto them, and pretty soon we've got litter boxes in the bathrooms at schools.
So now,
It just isn't happening. So.
and I hear you, but I will say this: if we were in Rifle, a woman in Rifle would have stood up and said, "How can we do this when the left is so full of crap and the propaganda and all the lies and the misdirection that we hear every single day? How can we possibly do this when they make all this stuff up?" You may think that that's not fair, but that's how they think it is. And we have to understand that. I think this is on us, not them. And we talked about this last night. We need to educate our children and ourselves to have critical thinking skills, to smell bullshit. And it's fun to, sometimes when something crazy happens, I will watch an hour of MS Now and an hour of Fox, and it's like, whoa, it's too, when like 3 million documents are released in the Epstein files, and you turn to Fox and they're saying, a dog was lost in the mountains and they found it today. And vice versa. I mean, it's crazy. And I'm as disenchanted with one as I am with the other. When I try to watch either one of them, I think, that's not really a portrait of an America that works. I do have my views of which is the worst, but that's neither here nor there. I think it's on us. We're not teaching ourselves critical thinking skills, and if you think it's bad now, are you noticing this? I see like videos online that appear to be authentic, and they ain't, and they're going to get more and more and more sophisticated. So we're going to be just overwhelmed with a blizzard of misinformation from every possible direction. I don't feel capable of sorting it all out. And so what you want to do is figure out who you trust. Where's Walter Cronkite? Where are the people that we, like a North Dakotan, as long as I get to brag about North Dakota, because we have so little. We have Eric Severide, and we have Lewis and Clark, and we have Lawrence Welk. And so Eric Severide, some of you remember Eric Severide, he was from Vail, North Dakota. He was on CBS Evening News for 3.5 minutes, a couple of times or 3 times per week. No B-roll, just Eric Severide looking like a Norse god into the camera. And whenever something happened, whether it was a riot or an assassination or a crisis somewhere in the world, my father and I would turn on CBS Evening News to hear what Eric Severide had to say about it. Now, he was a little left of center, but people trusted him to tell the truth as he saw it, not to make stuff up. And he was like a Greek chorus. You don't always agree, but it was someone who you could rely on to comment on the situation. John Chancellor at NBC News was like that. There were others. Ted Koppel was a little to the left, but he also was reliable. Today we have the market determines these things, and both sides emphasize only what they want to hear and not otherwise. And that's no way to run a democracy. And so I just urge you to accept that the right is having a comment like this at this moment, saying the left is full of it. And that may not be your reality, but that's the reality of the fundamental divide of American life. And who would you turn to? Who would you think is the most reliable person in American life? What? I do love PBS, although, you know, there are people that believe it's the People's Republic of PBS. I do think PBS and NPR are exemplary, and they're actually much more centrist than their reputations. I do trust that a lot. You know, I like George Will. I don't always agree with him, but I think he's a smart cookie. We're lacking truth seekers, and truth seekers are going to tell you things you don't want to hear. And I don't think on MSNBC you stand a chance whatsoever of appearing on it if you don't want to say what the party line is. And I'll say this, and it might offend you. I'm no friend to Fox because I think that it does some really creepy stuff. But I think there is more openness to other points of view on Fox than there tends to be on MSNBC. That's a phalanx. And I don't want to live in a phalanx. I do watch it. But I want to live in a world where there's a diversity of perspectives, and they're civil to each other, and they try to hammer it out. And we just don't have that at the moment, and I think it's killing us. And it's partly because of the silo effect. It's also that we left the fairness, we abandoned the fairness doctrine back in the Reagan administration. And if you have a fairness doctrine, at least you're going to get at least 2 points of view on every question. We need to stop, right? Last one. You think? Because I think people would stay until 11.
I should have ordered pizza.
Come to France. Come to France. Come to France.
Well, and did we mention he's on PBS early next week after that comment? Kristen from the Lewis and Clark trip sends her greetings from sunny California. I don't think she realizes we have the same weather. She concurs and loves your idea of having 5 senators for California. But her questions are, do you think it's possible to pass an equal rights amendment with revision or currently? And what is your most important amendment?
My most important?
Amendment.
Amendment, besides the amendment. The paradoxical amendment. You know, I think we need there's a whole series of things we need. I'm obsessed with war powers. I lived through Vietnam on the flimsiest authorization, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which rocked this country to its foundations. I used to do the Jefferson Hour before I did Listening to America, and when we were proposing the war in Iraq, my partner David Swenson and I did a broadcast in which we said, this thing's gonna not work out. And we got hate mail from all over the country. But we put it in a box, and when the war didn't work out, we played it again. And then we really got hate mail. I think war powers are something, I think that we're crippling the future with our national debt. I think that's appalling. I think we should, these are problems that could be solved legislatively if we had the will to do it. I'll just give you a couple because I know we have to stop. And these aren't really amendments, but number one, let's just look at what's happening with air traffic controllers and so on. I would fine members of Congress $10,000 a day until they write the legislation to solve that problem. I would forbid omnibus legislation, big beautiful bills of any sort, because you know what happens. You sneak in a whole bunch of stuff that no one will ever see. We need discrete defense legislation, social security legislation, education legislation. When you do an omnibus bill, it's a provocation for corruption and abuse and waste. And we know that. This is indisputable. So I would force that. I would force a budget, and I would fine members of Congress $25,000 a day when they don't have a budget, when the time the budget needs to be done. I would force members of Congress to abide by all laws that they impose on the rest of the American people, which they routinely do not. I would force Congress to go out on the market and buy private health care. You know, we subsidize them to 75% for a cute little healthcare system, and the rest of the country is just on its own. Congress doesn't understand what life is like for most Americans. You know, think of I travel a lot. I was at the Bismarck Airport. You can read about it in Listening to America. I hope you'll sign up for my weekly newsletter. It's free and all of that. And this week I wrote about it. And I said, I talked to these air traffic controllers on my last flights, and I said, how are you doing? They said, well, we're not going to quit. We probably will be paid. We feel it's our duty to continue working, but it's a terrible strain. I thought, when's the last time a congressperson had to sit at the kitchen table and wonder if they should pay the rent or the grocery bill? It is absolutely unacceptable that the people in power don't understand what it is like to be an actual citizen of the United States. And we should punish them, and we have that power. And Jefferson said, throw the rascals out. And if we threw the rascals out, if we retired 1/3 of the Senate in November and all of the House, I promise you we would be better governed. We have just become complacent, and the reason why we're complacent is we have it so well. We've never had it so well, and you above all live in an extraordinary privilege. But your world is not the world of small towns in Montana, I can tell you that. It's not the world of Indian reservations. It's not the world in the Deep South. And I don't criticize your privilege, but you need to understand that the world doesn't operate in the way that it operates for you and for me. And I don't think Congress understands this, and I don't think they're responsive to the people, and I don't think that they're fair. I'm pretty disillusioned with Congress more than with the presidency, because their sacred duty is to check the other branches, and they haven't been doing it. And they haven't been doing it because they're afraid to, or they don't understand what's at stake. And I'll stop with this sentence. The whole basis of our constitutional structure is checks and balances and separation of powers. That's gone. And until we reinvigorate that, we cannot be a republic. And if you think you're going to do that by routine legislation, I say tear it up. See you next time.
Ladies and gentlemen, Clay Jenkinson.
Hey-ho!
I hear a new book in the works there, Mr. Jenkinson.